Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm excited to have you here today. We're about to explore a fascinating topic: what your love style says about your childhood. In this presentation, we'll uncover how your approach to love can be linked to your early life experiences. We'll look at different love styles and what they reveal about your past. So, let's get started and dive into this insightful journey together. Let's talk about the avoider. In adult behavior, the avoider often comes across as distant and unemotional, which can make them seem a bit hard to connect with on an emotional level. They're typically uncomfortable with emotional intimacy, meaning they might shy away from deep conversations or sharing their true feelings. One of the key things to understand is that they value independence very highly. Personal space and autonomy are really important to them, and they tend to prioritize these over close emotional bonds. Recognizing these traits helps us see how their need for independence can sometimes act as a barrier to forming deeper connections. This fits into our overall theme of understanding different attachment styles and how they influence adult relationships. It's about seeing these behaviors not as flaws, but as ways people protect themselves or cope with vulnerability. When I think about childhood roots, what stands out is growing up in a home where affection was minimal and independence was really emphasized. It wasn't a home where you'd get a lot of cuddles or emotional support. Instead, I learned early on that I had to rely on myself. When I got upset, comfort was often unavailable or just not offered, so I had to find other ways to cope. Over time, I started to see that showing my feelings wasn't safe or welcomed, so I began to suppress them. This became a survival strategy, detaching from my emotions to protect myself. The key insight here is that avoiders, like myself, learned early on that our emotional needs wouldn't be met. So naturally, we stopped asking for what we needed. This pattern of detachment and emotional withdrawal is often rooted in these childhood experiences, and understanding this helps us see why emotional closeness can feel so threatening or difficult later in life. It's all connected to the larger theme of how early environments shape our ways of relating and coping. Let's talk about the vacillator. This is someone who tends to idealize new relationships, really craving that perfect connection. But the moment reality sets in and things don't match those high expectations, they can quickly become disillusioned. They often fear abandonment easily, which can make their relationships quite turbulent. Now, looking at their childhood roots, many of these individuals grew up with inconsistent parenting. Sometimes they received affection, but other times their parents were absent or distracted. This unpredictability left them hypervigilant and very sensitive to rejection, because they learned early on that love could be unstable. The key insight here is that vacillators deeply crave deep, meaningful connection. Yet, they also fear the inconsistency they experienced growing up. Their hope for a perfect love often clashes with the reality they face, leading to that push and pull dynamic. It's a classic example of how childhood experiences shape adult relationship patterns, and understanding this helps us see why they behave the way they do. On this slide, we're focusing on the controller. Adult controllers often feel a strong need to be in control in their relationships. They do this because they're trying to avoid vulnerability, which can be pretty scary. You'll notice that many controllers use anger as a shield, kind of like a barrier, to protect themselves from feelings of fear, humiliation, or helplessness. They often demand that things be done their way, because that's how they feel safe. Looking at childhood roots, many controllers grew up in homes that felt unsafe or chaotic. Protection was lacking, so they had to fend for themselves from a young age. This experience often led them to develop emotional toughness as a kind of armor. Control became their way of preventing more pain or chaos from happening. The key insight here is that controllers often equate safety with control. They believe that if they can control their environment or their relationships, they'll be safe. But here's the tricky part. This defensiveness can actually push people away and make genuine intimacy harder to achieve. So, understanding this pattern helps us see why controllers act the way they do, and how their past influences their present behavior. So, when we talk about the pleaser, what really defines this adult behavior is a constant focus on making others happy. They often put others' needs before their own and go to great lengths to avoid conflict. Saying no can be incredibly difficult for them, and sometimes they might even lie or simply go along with what others want, just to keep the peace. This behavior often stems from childhood. Their parents might have been critical, controlling, or even volatile. As children, they learned that pleasing others was the way to stay safe, to avoid punishment or rejection. Instead of receiving comfort, they became the ones providing it, trying to soothe their parents' anxieties or frustrations. They often grew up feeling like they had to be the good kid, even at their own expense. What's really important to understand here is that pleasers often confuse compliance with love. They believe that by always saying yes and keeping everyone happy, they're showing love. But the hidden cost is their own sense of self. They end up erasing their own needs and boundaries. This pattern can be exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. Recognizing this is a key step toward understanding how these behaviors develop and how we might begin to shift toward healthier ways of relating to ourselves and others. Let's take a closer look at the victim, specifically in the context of adult behavior. Many victims struggle with feelings of low self-worth, depression, or anxiety. These internal struggles often lead them to submit in relationships, naturally gravitating toward controllers or more dominant personalities. They tend to find compliance safer than resistance because resisting might feel risky or unsafe to them. Sometimes, victims escape their reality by retreating into fantasy or imagination, which provides a temporary refuge from their pain. Now, if we look back to childhood roots, we see that many victims grew up in chaotic or even violent environments. In such settings, compliance was a survival strategy. If they spoke up or asserted their needs, they risked provoking harm. So, staying invisible and enduring difficult circumstances was often the safest option. Resisting or asserting oneself could have meant danger, so they learned to stay quiet and endure. The key insight here is that victims often replicate that helplessness from childhood into their adult relationships. They mistake endurance for safety, believing that simply enduring the situation keeps them safe, even if it means sacrificing their own needs or well-being. Recognizing this pattern helps us understand how deeply these behaviors are rooted and why breaking free can be so challenging. Ultimately, understanding the victim's perspective is crucial in addressing the cycle and guiding them toward healthier patterns. Now, let's talk about why this really matters. Your love style isn't set in stone. Think of it as a map rather than a destiny. When you recognize the survival strategies you adopted as a child, you start to see how those patterns show up in your adult relationships. For example, avoiders might find that trusting vulnerability is challenging, but with awareness, they can learn to open up. Vacillators often struggle with patience and accepting imperfection, yet they can practice grace and understanding. Controllers may seek safety through control, but exploring surrender can bring more peace. Pleasers might feel the need to constantly accommodate others, and reclaiming their voice is a powerful step. Victims, on the other hand, can rediscover their strength and resilience. Healing begins when we understand that what once protected us in childhood, those survival strategies, may now be limiting us as adults. Love becomes healthier and more authentic when we realize we're no longer operating from old wounds. Instead, we can choose consciously how to show up in our relationships. So, this awareness isn't just about understanding ourselves. It's about transforming how we connect and love in a more mindful, empowered way. So, looking at this final slide, I want you to really reflect on which of these love styles resonates with you the most. Think about the patterns you've noticed in your own relationships. Are you more of a secure, avoidant, anxious, or perhaps a mix? And more importantly, I want you to consider how you're rewriting the script today. What new approaches are you taking? How are you changing your mindset or behaviors to foster healthier, more fulfilling connections? Remember, understanding these love styles isn't just about self-awareness. It's about empowering you to create the love life you truly want. So, as we wrap up, I encourage you to take this reflection seriously and think about the positive changes you're making moving forward.